hello, good afternoon, good day, everybody, depending on what part of this beautiful country that you're in. Welcome to the Rebel News daily live stream, something we're calling Breakdown. I'm your host, Sheila Gunn-Reid, and I'm surprisingly in studio in Toronto today, and I'm joined by Keith Wilson, one of the lawyers for the Convoy. And just to give everybody a little bit of background about what we're going to talk about today, in case you've been living under a rock or consuming a little bit too much CBC. We are covering the Public Order Emergency Commission, what we're calling here at Rebel News the Trucker Commission, and it's the official examination of the actions of the government in invoking the Emergencies Act, a wartime law that suspends civil liberties to extinguish completely peaceful protests in our nation's capital. Justin Trudeau did the old Hugo Chavez move on peaceful anti-regime protesters, and now he has to answer for it. Keith, crazy day today, because I think this is, for the first time in a long time, we saw some political people testifying again. We saw that at the beginning of the commission with some of the councillors, the busybody councillors, Councillor Fleury and McKinney from the city of Ottawa. But now we're seeing political appointee bureaucrats from Justin Trudeau's closest bureaucrats, the Privy Council. They're testifying to their involvement in the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. We had Janice Charest. She's the chief clerk of the Privy Council. She is the secretary, the note taker for cabinet. So she's privy to a lot of things. And, you know, I tuned into her testimony later on in the day when they were talking about, you know, the threats that necessitated the Emergencies Act. And she said at some point, and I'm sure we have the clip, Efron will go to that in a second, but I also promised Efron that I would go to all the clips in order so I wouldn't confuse him. But she did say that, you know, even if there weren't threats, there was sort of this general feeling of threats, and that seemed to be enough. Keith, what's your overall overview? I guess your high-level macro overview of what happened today.
Well, I think what we saw today was a breakdown in the rule of law. And what do I mean by that? Like, we hear that expression a lot, and it has many meanings, but its most simplest meaning is what it's contrasted with, is that we used to have in the 1400s and the 1500s and up until the Magna Carta, we used to have rule by man. The king's whims became the law, and the laws changed with the whims of the king. And we were supposed to replace that with the rule of law, which means government, the king, the prime minister, can only do that which the law allows him to do. And what we heard today was that the advisors to cabinet, the advisors to the prime minister, they find that a little awkward and, you know, a little inconvenient. So they've decided that they actually get to decide. That's my high level summary of the remarkable testimony today.
You know, that should bring us to our first clip, because Janice Charest, she's the clerk, she said that she recalled Trudeau government's mindset after introducing a cross-border vaccine mandate for truckers. She told the commission that Canadians were getting a bit fed up with the restrictions and measures, but quickly and far less patiently, the Trudeau government lost their patience with peaceful protesters in the nation's capital. Why don't we go to clip 1, Efron, please?
January the 15th, there was a change in the public health measures related to COVID that affected truckers in the country. It affected cross-border traffic. And that change was for truckers that were unvaccinated coming in back into the country. They had been previously exempt, and they were now going to be subject to public health measures. And so we were monitoring very closely both the implementation of that measure as well as talking to the Trucking Association and monitoring, because it was clear that at that point in time, despite the very serious record levels of COVID we were facing, that Canadians were kind of getting a bit fed up at that point in time with the restrictions and the measures and what they were having to deal with. So that was very much on our minds.
I don't think it was all that much on their minds, because the point of the protest, or the catalyst for the protest, was the cross-border vaccine mandate for truckers. So it wasn't as though people were getting just sick of the existing restrictions and the never-ending lockdowns, but it was the fact that after, a couple of years of living with this, with hindsight being 2020, they were still adding more restrictions and hindering people's lives and their Section 6 charter rights to move. It's like these people don't talk to normal people at all.
That was our impression yesterday, too, coming out of the testimony from some of the officials yesterday, is that, these guys live in an upside-down world bubble. It's just remarkable how out of touch. One of the things I really want to say is I was watching online because I was working on things for this hearing as well as another case. So I wasn't in the hearing, which was a really good thing because I was shouting at my screen quite a bit, quite loudly. And one of the things that incensed me was when the senior official yesterday, I think it was the deputy minister, one of the deputy ministers talked about that, we needed to understand that when the borders were closed for a little while, that there was real people who were out of work and couldn't make mortgage payments. I was like, are you kidding me? What about the millions of people you harmed with these excessive lockdowns combined with the provincial governments? What about the over 6 million Canadians who are prevented from being at the side of dying loved ones or at attending weddings and the birth of their first grandchild? The businesses that were lost, the people who were forced out of their work, the thousands and thousands of airport workers alone that the federal government put out of work. It just blew my mind, the level of insensitivity and lack of awareness of the harms that their overreach caused, which was the catalyst for the protests becoming so big and multitude.
Yeah, it was an added restriction where people said, no, enough is enough. And yet they still can't figure out, all this time, and they still don't know why so many people left everything behind to go across the country to their nation's capital to just try to be heard. And even still, they don't know why those people came. It's just astounding to me. We have got another clip. Privy Council bureaucrat Jacqueline Bogdan. She testified that the government began doing its homework on the Emergencies Act as a potential option on and around February 9th. That's a day before the first instant response group meeting and before the act was invoked on February 14th. But that's also in and around the time that you and your people started negotiating, isn't it? So you were working to end the protest, or at least end some of the inconvenience of the protest. And the government, our government, your government, is actively working to treat you like terrorists at the exact same time.
Correct. And getting recommendations from their senior officials that they follow the steps that we'd started to take in terms of the leadership of the Freedom Convoy, myself and other lawyers, and Tom Marazzo, in terms of trying to negotiate a de-escalation. And it was vetoed at cabinet. They didn't want de-escalation.
No. And you know what? I think that's a theme through all of this, is they keep talking about the violence and the threats, or the potential for violence, or the discomfort of the protests. But the convoy was met with extreme force. And not even, as you rightly pointed out once, not even a window was broken. No cops were hurt. No cops were trampled. And the cops were outnumbered everywhere they looked. And so if there were to be mayhem, carnage, mob violence, a riot, there could have been, there never was, because even in spite of provocation by the state, the convoy remained peaceful. They were not the violent radicals that they were predicted to be, not even for a second, not even when they were provoked.
The discipline of the truckers to avoid the provocations was remarkable, right down to, as you know, keeping the streets clean, shoveling the snow, feeding the homeless. The other thing I think about, Sheila, is, we're both from Alberta. Some of those truckers would have gone into their trucks before they left Alberta, especially guys that operate out of their homes on an acreage or a farm, and taken the shotgun out
for sure.
and put it in the safe. There's just the fact that they searched every one of those trucks and found not a single gun meant and I'm not criticizing, there would be good reasons for some truckers to have a firearm. And so it just showed the extent to which Canadians who participated in this were so focused on staying on message and not giving the government the excuse that it so badly wanted.
Yeah. And you have to give them credit for their savvy too. Their media savvy, because, 22 behind the seat of a grain truck, that's common. But if that had made its way all the way to Ottawa, it would have been a real media catastrophe for the truckers, but it never was. Efron, why don't you roll clip 2? I called for it. I ragged the puck a little bit so you could bring it up. Can you roll it?
So when would the Privy Council office have started to do its homework on the Emergencies Act? When would you or somebody in your office have first started to look at it as a potential option?
It would have probably been on or around the 9th.
Okay, so it would have been only a day before the first meeting of the incident response group when it was being discussed there.
Yep, I think
and
that's right.
No work was done on the Emergencies Act before that.
So I can't say that definitively. Work would have been being done by a lot of different people on an anticipatory basis that making sure, as I said, that we've done our homework and we would be in a position to answer questions, right? Like if the government turned to the public servants and said, what's involved with invocation of the Act? You need to be able to answer all kinds of first order questions, right? Everything from the threshold that's to be met to what's the parliamentary process, what kinds of considerations do you want to be thinking about? So I can't say definitively who was working on what. I wasn't directing that work. So I'm not being evasive. I'm just trying to understand it was all hands on deck at that point, and I can't speak to every part of the public service.
I feel like I'm listening to Kamala Harris say a lot of words, but actually nothing. She spent a couple of minutes there telling me that there were a lot of people doing things, and I'm not quite sure what they were doing. And it sounds a lot like the Ottawa Police Service. However, the ineptitude of bureaucrats and local police do not an emergency constitute.
No, and we've seen that with the police and the governmental responses and their infighting and their disorganized or lack of organization and all that nonsense. Incompetency, I've checked the Act again, Sheila. Incompetency is not listed as a ground for invoking the Emergencies Act, stripping Canadians of their rights, giving unrestricted powers to the federal government to do whatever it wants with your bank account and your assets, and interfering in provincial jurisdiction. Incompetency is not the trigger. This is supposed to be used for the equivalent of a war or a civil war. And the Prime Minister's office decided that he would get to decide when he was going to use it.
Yeah, I don't think we can say that often enough. This is for a 9/11 level event. This is for a Pearl Harbor style strike on the homeland. This is not for bouncy castles and hot tubs and a little bit of too much jubilancy in the boring streets of Ottawa. That's my real takeaway from all of this is I think the people who live in Ottawa are quite boring. They didn't like all those exciting blue-collar people from the rest of the country just mucking up their white-collar streets. You're a lawyer, so I'm glad I have you for this next one. We have, I guess she is now the assistant or deputy clerk of the Privy Council office, Natalie Drouin. She says that on the ground, the RCMP didn't have jurisdiction to address the situation prior to invoking the Emergencies Act. And this is an important claim that she's making. However, I don't think it's accurate. And you're the lawyer, so I'll let you decide. But that's one of the grounds for invoking the Emergencies Act is that police didn't have existing tools that they needed to deal with it. Let's watch the clip, and then you can give me your expert legal advice on whether or not this is true.
Sure.
So all the indicators were towards it is, the federal government is owning the situation. And yet on the ground, RCMP, for example, didn't have jurisdiction on Wellington Street. We don't have jurisdiction on routes that brings you to the bridge. So it feels that we owned it publicly, but we didn't have jurisdiction to address the situation.
Is that true?
No.
Okay.
I mean, parts of it, but I mean, welcome to Canada. We have the division of powers, right?
Right.
And it's interesting being from Alberta. You know, here you almost never see outside of Ottawa an RCMP cruiser, whereas in Alberta, that's all we see unless you're in one of the cities, right? So for us in Alberta and out west, BC, you know, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the RCMP do the municipal policing, they do the provincial policing, and they do the federal policing. Whereas here, you know, the local Ottawa police do the municipal and the provincial, and then the provincial police do the stuff outside of the cities. And then there's this very limited role for the RCMP. But it's a red herring, because the reality is that they have public order units with the RCMP that were on standby and ready to be deployed. A request to deploy them was made up through the chain, and Commissioner Lucky said, no, not yet. We had the deputization process that was modified to expedite the process of deputizing police so that they could act within the city of Ottawa. They're just red herrings. What I noticed today was they threw these later witnesses that are really speaking from the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Office, threw Commissioner Lucky under the bus. Yep. She is going to be one of their scapegoats. And the maneuver that they used was their disappointment with her not communicating a plan, a police action plan to deal with the protesters in Ottawa. Therefore, because of the failure of the RCMP and the other police forces to communicate a plan, they had to go and grab the small thermonuclear device and throw it, which is being the Emergencies Act.
You know, that's interesting, too, because it'll take us into the next clip. Clip 4, it's, again, Clerk of the Privy Council, Janice Charette, I guess, detailing how the government had been hearing about plans being developed to end the Freedom Convoy and some of the other protests. But by the third weekend, they hadn't seen any action to end what she called the horrific, these boring people, situation in Ottawa. But that's not true, because we heard that Cabinet had been informed that there were ongoing negotiations between yourself, Tamara Lich, and Mayor Watson to alleviate some of the problems plaguing the busybodies in downtown Ottawa. So from based on other testimony and emails presented before the commission, this just absolutely isn't true. And this is someone whose job it is to detail the comings and goings and meetings within Cabinet. We've seen evidence that Cabinet was aware that things were happening and that the truckers were operating in good faith and moving trucks out of the downtown core when she's saying this.
Well, and it's more than, to be very precise about it, you know, the negotiations started earlier in the previous week.
Yep.
They had to be done quietly, as normal in a delicate situation.
Sure.
The full board of directors, contrary to someone who seems to have forgotten the events, a former board member who speaks out, was fully briefed at every stage of the negotiations. There was very few things I had the luxury of doing in writing while I was there in Ottawa during the protests because of the speed of events. There was one thing I made sure I did in writing in emails was get all of the board members to sign off on the deal with the mayor that was agreed to on the Friday night, which would have been the 11th. The letters were exchanged on the 12th and the deal finalized the Saturday. And then on the Sunday, we agreed to let the mayor go first and release it to the media. And then on the Sunday night, when the cabinet met, as you've just noted, the senior security advisor who testified yesterday had reported to the cabinet that there was a breakthrough agreement, that was the phraseology they used, with the truckers to relocate out of downtown and concentrate on Wellington, with the rest going out to Van Cleef and the other areas. And despite that, and despite the fact that All of the borders were now reopened, and that's been confirmed.
Yep.
With the municipal officials from the different jurisdictions, with the police officials, with the Canadian Border Service in the last week, that all the borders reopened. Didn't matter. Only thing that was left was Ottawa. I think the Prime Minister was angry that the non-laptop class had risen up against him, and he was going to show them who really has the authoritarian power here.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And it's funny because these people are testifying, and I don't know if, again, did they live in a bubble? Are they watching the other testimony? Are they being briefed on the documents that are already in front of the Public Order Commission? Like, I don't understand how they can just walk in there and testify to completely different reality from what we have a paper trail to prove.
Well, they're hoping that their paid media, the legacy media that's now on the government payroll, and I feel sorry for a lot of those reporters because I'm sure that some of them don't sleep very well at night because they can't report the truth anymore like they used to. They have to say, all right, if this story goes out, well, we're not going to get our $100 and whatever million from the government. And that means we might not make payroll. And we can't make payroll. I'm not going to get a paycheck. And then what am I going to tell my wife or my spouse about the mortgage? So I think what they're hoping is their sound bites that they're doing right now. And you saw it really in spades this Friday afternoon, with the cabinet level people speaking in terms of staff, that their sound bites will get out, and then that will become the narrative. And the narrative will be two parts. One is that the police failed to act, so the Prime Minister had to keep Canadians safe. And number two will be that when you look at the totality of the circumstances, despite the fact that CSIS said the legal test wasn't met, the OPP intelligence officer said the test wasn't met, every official that's testified said the legal test to invoke wasn't met, they're just going to say, well, we're the cabinet, I'm the Prime Minister, poo-poo to this rule of law stuff. We like it better the way it was in the 1400s when the king gets to decide.
Yeah, they spent the last 2.5 years telling me to listen to the experts, and then the policing experts testify and they tell me, no, Sheila, don't believe those people. Agree with these political appointees appointed by the Liberals. Those are the people you need to listen to.
Good point.
Yeah. Clip 6, Efron, the one that I jumped out of my chair and ran across the room to you to clip when it was happening live. I was much like you, Keith, in that I was sitting at this desk because there's no other desk for me to work at in HQ. And every time I heard something crazy, I ran into the control room and said, Efron, we have to clip this. Because in clip 6, to justify the use of the Emergencies Act, the chief clerk of the Privy Council finally said something that I agree with. But she didn't realize that she was probably agreeing with the truckers when she said this too. She said that economic security is directly correlated with the ability to maintain and operate secure borders. I can't wait till somebody tells this lady about Roxham Road or the vaccine mandates that caused the truckers to begin this protest in the first place. Yeah, we do care about operating secure borders and the ability to engage in trade across them. Let's roll this clip. Again, just completely lacking in self-awareness.
Yeah.
So the economic risk, particularly at a time, and I think I tried to set the seed for this when I was talking about the fact that we were just starting budget deliberations as this was all happening. And I think Mr. Sabia spoke of other relevant considerations related to United States potential legislation that was being deliberated at the time, which had big impacts on Canada, our competitiveness, our ability to continue to attract investment. So when I think about national interest, our economic security is absolutely part of that. And that is about the ability to maintain and operate secure borders, to see to the free movement of people, goods, and services across our borders. We do $2 billion of trade a day between Canada and the United States, the single most integrated, I think, economy in the world.
What does that lady think the truckers were there protesting for? That's exactly what they were there protesting for. The ability to engage in cross-border trade, because that was their job. The free movement of people and goods across the largest undefended border in the world. That's why they were there. She and the cabinet were the problem. That just blew my mind, but I was like, yeah, I actually agree with you there.
Well, and this is what causes me to react strongly, is that, okay, I think we agree that what she said is important about the free movement of goods across the border, the free movement of people she talked about across the border. And let's think Canadians or people traveling lawfully. They're just completely tone deaf, because look at the economic harm they caused by the border closures, by the travel restrictions, by just even the, when we lost the knowledgeable people in the trucker industry tell me that it was about 35% of the drivers were lost for cross-border movement.
Yep.
At a time when we already had, we have logistics problems and we have supply chain issues. So a lot of the trade, I'm told from different people I know outside of my normal legal spheres, which I like to have a lot of people around me in that way so that I keep my eyes open to things, that they started shipping in goods and products by air. Well, what did they do to the airports? There was over 10,000 airport workers of various kinds that lost their jobs because they were exercised their choice not to get vaccinated. The tourism industry, who was going to take a trip to Canada if you had to quarantine for 14 days? But, come on. So just the tourism sector alone impacts is in the billions of dollars. So if they really care about these things, they would not have been the exception of G7 countries. A lot of Canadians don't realize that we had more restrictions in place than any other G7 country, and we had them in longer than any other G7 country. So the hypocrisy of these people, their lack of self-awareness, as you put it, I think is bang on the mark. It's spectacular.
And you wouldn't want those truckers traveling across the border, just a couple of hours across the border, and seeing people living normally, and then coming back to Canada and saying, you know what, things are normal in Florida or South Dakota, which is so close to the border. You wouldn't want people coming home with a new benchmark for normal, because then, you know what, they just might rise up and protest you in the nation's capital. And looky here, we've got another national emergency on our hands.
Indeed. Yeah, it's, well, and even I think that's, I'm counsel to former Premier Peckford on the travel mandate challenge. And I think one of the reasons they took it down when they did or suspended it in June of this year, June 15th, was because enough people had started to travel through Europe and through England and everywhere else. And they're like, wow, COVID's over here. And then all of a sudden they get on the plane and they're told they got to put a mask on as soon as they get close to Canada. And then they arrive in this, public health officials in gowns and face shields everywhere and channeling them into booths to be prodded and tested. And so I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of people.
Yeah, when uptight progressive Europe goes back to normal before you do. Houston, we have
many months before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When I traveled to Geneva to deliver our human rights complaint to the UN there, you could tell where the Air Canada gates were at the airport, because everything was normal until you got to the Air Canada gate.
Wow.
And then everything was just oppressive. And everybody was in a mask. And, the flight attendants looked like they were going into brain surgery. And that was, just a few months ago that we were still doing this sort of madness. Keith, I want to ask you your predictions before I let you go for next week. Next week, we're going to start to see even more political people. Members of the cabinet are going to testify. Oh, what do you expect to hear from that? More gaslighting and a rewriting of history? Or are we going to see some truth?
I think you're going to see replay. I think this afternoon was the test of the messaging.
Yeah.
They sent in, there were highly rehearsed. There's even a couple times where the witness would go, let me see if I can remember the words. And she wasn't. Yeah, she wasn't talking about the words from an act. It was the words they practiced over and over again. So I think today was the test. I think they're kind of okay with how it went. So I think you're going to see the same messaging from the ministers. But that means we just have to figure out how to crack that nut this weekend and give them a little surprise come Monday, Tuesday. So that's what we'll do.
Well, I'm very, very excited, and I'll be in Ottawa on Monday and Tuesday to see it firsthand for myself. So I'm very excited about that. Keith, I guess maybe I'll see you Monday or Tuesday.
Absolutely. In person. It'll be wonderful.
Great.